Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. So if you had a story about being a good man and that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd actually listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr Ray Swann, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. In our podcast today, we speak with Jeff Kennett. Many of you would know of Jeff as the 43rd Premier of Victoria, or as the President of the Hawthorn Football Club and a media commentator. But he's also the founding chairman of Beyond Blue, a national organisation which works to reduce the impact of depression and anxiety amongst the community. Not only that, he's a proud father of 4 children. Jeff Kennett, welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. One of the things I was really keen to get you thinking around just to start off with was about voice, about finding your voice, about using your voice, about listening to others. I was wondering if you were able to share a little bit about your story and how you've developed your public voice over the years. Were there any key mentors or key moments in your life that sort of helped to shape you and the way in which you encounter others?
No, there's no specific once-off training or experience that has allowed me to develop my communication skills. But I think the lessons you get at home, the example that are set by your parents, is without a doubt the most important training anyone can get. When you go to school and to secondary school, and if you go to university, to me, the school is important in terms of academic outcomes, but it's not the most important ingredient. The most important ingredient for any school, to me, is to give the boy, the girl, the child, good communication skills. Because if you have good communication skills, you can converse, you can argue, you can compete in any environment. But if you can't express yourself, if you can't express yourself with confidence, then you're at a real disadvantage. So when I was at school last century, I was not a very good scholar, far from it. I was almost expelled in 4th form. But I finished school in the company of some very bright, intellectually bright individuals. And they've gone on and done a range of subjects, followed different careers. But some of them could never communicate. And it doesn't matter how bright you are, if you can't express yourself, then you're at a disadvantage. So what contributes to making a young man, a strong man, and a good man? More often than not, it's the values they're taught at home, not through instruction, but by example. And secondly, it is their ability to communicate. And if you can communicate well, it's often a sign that that individual is confident about themselves. People who don't have confidence often find themselves falling through the cracks. So good communication skills is terribly important.
Yes. Do you think that there's, just tapping in on your comment about values, do you think communication and confidence is strengthened when someone has a strong sense of what they stand for and what they believe in terms of their value set?
Yes, I do. And my value sets are very, very simple. And I judge people by them all the time. So I like people who are punctual. So when I make an appointment to see someone, I make sure I am on time. If they're coming to see me, they better be on time, otherwise the door will be closed. I look then at their shoes, particularly if I'm interviewing for a job, particularly men, and I'll see whether their shoes are clean and particularly their heels are clean. I want to make sure that they have a good work ethic, which is a value. And fourthly, I want to make sure that they're not overly nervous. So I look at their fingernails. And if they've bitten their fingernails, then I know that they're nervous and on edge and are not as perhaps as entirely settled as I would like. So the simple values of work ethic, of knowing what's right and wrong, of being punctual, of presenting well, personally, to me is very, very important. So you get those values, and then through the experiences of life at home and at school, you develop good communication skills. You're in a pretty good position to take on the world.
Absolutely. Jeff, one of the things that we've asked the guests over time is a little bit about their backgrounds and how they ended up where they are. It's fascinating, your career. I mean, we talk about career journeys these days and people having, 4 or 5 or more different careers, and yet it would appear that in many respects that's what you've had, being, in military, Maya at, advertising, politics and in sport. I'm just fascinated, in your thinking around that, in those different changes and different moments that you had in your careers. What kind of led you to choose from one to the other? Was there a kind of a general theme to any of that?
There was no sitting down saying at the age of 10 or 15, I'm going to do A, B, C and D. They've fundamentally rolled as occasions have arisen, opportunities have arisen, time passed. You missed out the most important career, and that is my career in founding and running Beyond Blue. Yeah. And so if people ask me today, what's the most important thing I've done in my life outside of family, I will say it is the creation of Beyond Blue and my stewardship there for 17 years. But you're right, I've had a variety of opportunities and continue to do so. And I think that's also important. And I think young men today should set out on life's paths knowing that they're going to have a lot of change. And change is good because at certain stages it introduces you to new people, new challenges, etc. And you want new challenges. You want to be excited. You don't want to get yourself into a rut. So therefore, yes, I've had a varied career and I continue to do so, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
One of the things I did want to ask you a bit about was Beyond Blue and what were some of the circumstances, in some ways ahead of the time, in some ways, as we know, the cost not ahead of the time, but in certainly many respects ahead of the time. And tell us a little bit about your thinking and what led you into creating Beyond Blue.
All right. Well, in 1997, when I was still Premier of Victoria, my daughter drove up from Geelong, where she was at Deakin University, in tears because 2 of her male friends had just died in 2 separate car accidents. And she came up to me and said, Dad, what can you do to stop these young men dying on the roads? And I thought we were both talking about the road toll. But when we looked into these 2 deaths, they'd both been left by their female partners. They were both heartbroken. They used their motor vehicles to take their lives, so they were suicides. So that got me thinking, what can we do to reduce the suicide levels? And I brought together a group of people, experts. I tried to get Canberra to take an interest and they didn't. We then lost the election in '99, and because I'd raised the profile of the need for a national approach to depressive illnesses, mental health, the Federal Minister of Health, Michael Wooldridge, and the then Premier of Victoria, Steve Bracks, gave me sufficient funds to establish Beyond Blue. So what was the motivation? It was a plea from my daughter to a father who at that stage had some influence, and that has led now to an organisation that is doing extraordinary work right throughout the country and overseas.
As an advocate, Jeff, I wonder, and again going back to my comments earlier about voice, and standing up for what you believe in and your beliefs and values. Do you have any advice for people when they find the going tough? Because I imagine, with the work that you've done over your career, and there's been times where you've had to influence or push or advocate for change, and I imagine that would come at some potential personal cost. How do you work through that? What do you go to keep yourself strong in those times?
I think the important thing is that individuals have got to develop a mechanism for dealing with stress and anxiety. Now, most people are going to experience some sort of stress during their life, and that's not a bad thing, as long as it's short term. Where it exists for a long period of time, you might need help. But I've developed a personal system which says, before I go to sleep every night, I will go through the day quickly. It'll only take less than, a second, half a second. wash out the things that I've done reasonably well and focus on the things that I've done badly or very badly, and ask myself, what could I have done to have avoided that? What do I have to do tomorrow to try and correct it or to apologise or whatever it may be? The beauty of that is that it allows you then to sleep, that you've addressed the problem. You just don't go to sleep with that problem continuing to make you toss and turn. And when they're more serious issues, so when you lose an election or when a parent dies, I have a scale from 0 to 10. So 0 is no concern, 10 is very serious. And I ask myself, well, where does that rate on my Richter scale? So my parents died when each of them went. It only rated to 1.5. That wasn't disrespectful to them, but they lived a long life. They hadn't had much ill health. I'm grateful for their company, etc., but it was the process. When Hawthorn loses a premiership, it might be an 11 or 12, but I deal with that quickly too. So there is a mechanism for actually assessing the things that cause you stress and anxiety. And when you actually think about it and weigh it against your rock, which is 0, and what is my rock? My rock is waking up every morning. So to me, the most important thing in life is actually waking up. And most people, yes, most young men, take life for granted. But they shouldn't. We don't know when our life's going to be extinguished, whether it's a car accident, a heart attack, a football accident. So the combination of waking up every morning and giving thanks for waking up, and at the end of the day, very quickly analysing what you've done and where you've made things that cause you stress and angst is very, very important to me. And that gives me the ability to sleep well, wake up confidently in the morning, looking forward to the rest of the day. In fact, every time I wake up, when I give thanks, and it doesn't matter to whom you give thanks, to me it's like Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture and the cannons are firing and I've got another day. How lucky can I be?
And I guess that connects into that sense of purpose and why, and I guess you know that desire to make a contribution to me.
Well, I think it helps you deal with your own issues. So many people don't deal with their issues and therefore they fester. And when they wake up, they're tired. They haven't had a good night's sleep. And so many people, because they don't develop a discipline to go through life, when they are in trouble, they don't seek help. So it's terribly important for young people to understand from an early age what the tools are that will help them through life, the changes that they'll incur, the speed humps that they're going to incur, for the next 60 years.
Yeah. Along with, as you were saying earlier, that idea of communication and confidence and being someone in the world. To that end, these days, when we look at the political spectrum more broadly, from a parent's perspective, how important do you think it is that we, as parents, get our children involved in understanding political issues and what's happening and in the world more broadly? Do you have any advice for parents in that?
Well, I think the first thing is that children today and my grandchildren don't listen to anything that I tell them if I'm trying to tell them. So you've got to seduce your children into thinking differently and behaving differently, and that's through leadership, that's through example, that's through natural discussion around the table. And yes, I think politics is important. The sad thing is that if you take the football club that I am president of, Hawthorn, we have more members than all the Liberal Party and Labor Party members combined. So there's very few people who are actually members of political parties, and therefore they're not active apart from the day on which they vote. But politics is important because it sets the rules, it sets so much of the regulations that we live our life by. So for children to be aware, to be involved, I think is very, very healthy. Of course, most children normally follow the political leanings of their parents, although I think in recent years that's changed a fair bit and will continue to change.
It seems to be the case that for younger people to be able to delineate between the two major political parties seems to also be problematic. Perhaps there's been a degree of sameness, or there hasn't been enough differentiation between the two parties. Would you share that view?
Yes, and I think that was pretty obvious at the last election. While the Conservatives won and have control of the House easily, the reality is when you look at the number of votes cast, there's only 150 or 200,000 out of the 16 million who voted being the difference. There's only about 150 or 200,000 people. So in terms of numbers of votes, it's all almost straight down the centre. But of course they were not always in seats that mattered.
For parents, Jeff, with the whole idea of raising healthy young men in the modern age that can flourish, and again we see so many examples of stories of men not behaving well, and I guess problematic for young men in particular in identity and looking for role models and so on. What are some of your thoughts in what it takes to be a good man these days?
Well, I think it goes back to the point of having a good foundation, good values. And I can't stress strongly enough the importance of assisting your children to a place where they can deal with stress and anxiety. Because if you can get them to that place, they're going to be able to deal with life a lot better than would otherwise be the case. And we're all hearing a lot more about mental health. There's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of expectation, there's a whole lot of ingredients going in. How does anyone deal with it? And the best way we can deal with it is for individuals to be specifically aware of developing a mechanism that they can deal with it themselves, rather than waiting until it gets to a certain point where they've got to go to a doctor or they've got to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and by then they're well into a heavy illness. So prevention is always better in one sense than the cure. So I would say to parents, values through example, and then to educate your children on how to deal with stress and anxiety.
I read a few weeks ago in the Australian, I don't know if you saw, that there was something like 100,000 young people who were on prescription antidepressants, and some of the healthcare professionals are talking about this idea of there being a bit of a cliff that we're about to go over. What do you see as the future for young Australians in the mental health space?
Well, firstly, I think the future for young Australians is fantastic, and I just wish I was a year younger. But given that that's not going to occur, but yes, there are a lot of pressures. The change is occurring at a pace we've never seen before. So, I've seen the invention of television, I've seen the invention of lawnmowers as we know them today, so many things. Television, when it first came in 56, I remember. So I've seen a lot of change. But that's nothing compared to the change that's occurring today. So again, I come back. How are you best going to be equipped as a parent or as a child for dealing with change? It's having a mechanism to deal with the stresses and anxieties that cause. So, I don't think life's difficult. It doesn't have to be difficult. But it does mean you have to accept more responsibility today than is probably generally accepted. Most people expect someone else to be doing the work for them. Someone else expects the doctor to heal them. When I was growing up, very few people knew what depression was about. Doctors weren't seeing many people who are depressed. Today, the majority of people walking into a doctor's surgery are depressed. So things have changed. Why? Because most of them haven't developed the mechanism to deal with the things that they go to the doctor for.
One of the last things we'll ask you today, Jeff, is about a story. We like to share stories for young men, and if you had one that you could share with a boy, a story or a piece of advice, young boy, say 14 years of age or so, and he'd actually listen to, what would your story be?
I think the two ingredients to a long and happy life is good health, and that's got to start with good mental health, and secondly, to be happy. So, as you progress through life, make sure you stay fit and well, physically and mentally, but also make sure that whatever you do, you enjoy. And don't stay in jobs that you don't enjoy. Move on. You don't have to penalise yourself. I mean, as I said earlier, life is very short. Even if you live to 100 years, it's short in the passage of time. We won't all live to that age. Young boys today have got a better chance of doing so. Young girls certainly will. It's a long time in the sense of potential number of careers. So if you're not happy, for goodness sake, change.
Jeff Kennett, thank you very much for your time on Understanding Voice today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.